Welcome to a webcast of a panel discussion from the 42nd Annual Conference, presented by the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions, Hunter College. The discussion took place in April 2015 at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City.
My name's Steve Greenhouse. I'm pinch hitting for whoever was supposed to moderate. And we have a very good panel today with an excellent paper by Gary Rhodes with some interesting findings about contingent faculty and somehow tying it to the the famous Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, I believe. And they brought dozens of kids down from Lawrence, Massachusetts to New York so New York families could feed them. And let's hope the same thing doesn't happen with adjunct professors in Massachusetts. So Gary Rhodes is a professor of higher education at the University of Arizona's Center for the Study of Higher Education. He's also director of the Center for the Future of Higher Education, a think tank of the Campaign for the Future of Higher Education. Gary's research focuses on the restructuring of academic institutions and professions. And as you'll see from his paper, he has reached some interesting conclusions, done some really good research. Who will talk next? Susan okay. Valerie Martin Conley is a associate professor of higher education and director of the Center for Higher Education at Ohio University. Valerie specializes in quantitative applications for educational policy and research, drawing upon her experience as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics. Susan Sherman, is a distinguished professor of labor studies and employment relations and dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. From 1997 to 2007, she served as the founding president of the National Labor College. She is past president of the United Association for Labor Education and was recently reelected to a second term as president of the International Federation of Workers' Education Associations. So we will start with Gary.
Good morning. Thank you, Steve, and I appreciate the understanding and reference to the strike 100 years ago, and that's part of the framing of my paper and of this, which is actually going to be a chapter in a book, and of this presentation. Bread and Roses and Quality 2. I think I'm going to change the and Quality 2 at the end of the presentation. A new faculty majority. I'm on the board of the new faculty majority, negotiating the new academy. I want to thank Bill Herbert for the chance to present this work and my colleagues for taking the time to read it and comment on it at a relatively late notice. And I also want to thank my colleagues in the contingent adjunct faculty labor movement, which in my view is at the heart, not just of the academic labor movement nationally, but of the labor movement generally. So I see Robin down here and some others I'm sure in the audience. I take a lot of inspiration from the work that you're doing, and it's a lot easier to do what I do, which is analyze collective bargaining agreements, analyze strategies, make suggestions, than it is to sit at the table and negotiate the language that I'm talking about. So I'm pretty sensitive to that reality. And I think I was just in Chicago at another conference, and not long ago I was rereading Studs Terkel. So I want to read a little something from Studs Terkel, which also frames my sense of the role of the adjunct labor, faculty labor movement in broader terms, which I think relates to our conference. The book is Hope Dies Last. I don't know how many of you have read any of this book. There's a chapter called Bread and Roses. It's about labor organizers. And in the introduction to this, he's framing his chapter on Bread and Roses. And he says, Nicholas von Hoffman put it succinctly several years ago. Often, in putting right their private wrongs, groups of people have reanimated our public rights. In these pages, Roberta Lynch, a Chicago labor organizer, observes it's about action. You feel that things can happen, the possibility, the hope. You feel ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Something comes along unexpectedly, something no one could have predicted. She's paraphrasing something that Bob Travis, a strike leader, said in 1937, and Bob Kelly, a Harvard custodian, echoed in 2002. People can surprise you. And I want to draw that sort of linkage to the surprising power in the last several years of the adjunct faculty movement, the connection of their work to fast food workers, low-wage workers throughout the economy, because what we're involved in is negotiating in the 21st century what we did 100 years ago. What are the rights of employees, and how do those rights and working conditions connect to our sense of, in this case, the institution of higher education and the sort of access of an affordable higher education that will be provided to the growth demographics of students who we have historically underserved, whether that's low-income students, students of color, or immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented. And this is a great place to be talking about that because that's obviously the history of CUNY. So, to give you briefly a little sense for those of you who don't know me of where I'm coming from, I'm a researcher in a state that has cacti and not a lot of the kind of rain that we're experiencing outside. I've written a little bit about this stuff over 30 years, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the book I'm working on now. I do a lot of work with, but I also am an equal opportunity participant with various unions, both the three main academic unions, but also SEIU and UAW. And I also often sit as the token faculty representative on management association task forces on shared governance, and one upcoming for NACUBO on new business models in higher education. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. The kind of work that I've done over the past 20 years is to analyze a national database of collective bargaining agreements that was constructed by the National Education Association, called HECUS, the Higher Education Contract Analysis System. When I first did this back in 1998 in this book, Managed Professionals, I just did chapters on salary structure, part-time faculty, retrenchment, technology, ownership of intellectual property. And what I'm going to do in this update and expanded version of it is to not only talk about how professionals, faculty are managed, but organizing. Because we're in the midst of the greatest foment in organizing in American higher education in 30 plus years. And so I'm interested in the kinds of strategies that are being used, the coalitions that are being formed both within and beyond the academy. And again, I think adjunct faculty are really right at the center of that. That database, back when I did that book, consisted at that time of 211 collective bargaining agreements nationally, faculty agreements. There are also agreements for educational support staff. It's now 494. That's 81% of the agreements identified in the center's directory of collective bargaining agreements. So it's a pretty big database. It includes contracts from a variety of unions, including independents. It does not have, and I'm going to do a separate analysis of some of the newest agreements in the private sector that Bill referred to earlier. A range of unions are doing this, but the four agreements I focused on were negotiated by locals of SEIU. And so it is an extensive and easily searchable database. And so what I've done in this database is to try and pick a clause, a provision in the contract that captures something essential about the working conditions and the negotiation that we're in the midst of right now about the rights and conditions of work of knowledge workers in our economy. And that's class cancellation fees. You're an adjunct faculty member, the day of classes, the day after classes, a week before, a day before, your class is canceled. Is there any sort of, in this just-in-time employment structure of employment that we have, this at-will, no due process employment structure, some contracts have been negotiated that apply some compensation, some fee paid back to the faculty member when their class is canceled. To me, that kind of captures several things. One is the structure of employment, where half the workforce now is part-time, 2/3 to 3/4 is contingent, depending on how you count the denominator. And these faculty members are at will. There's very little to no due process. They may be preparing classes over a summer and be notified a day or two before class, or as I said, the day of class, the class is canceled. This, it seems to me, and this is to reach to the broader issues, clarifies how their working conditions of their students as learning conditions. This is obviously not good for the students, for them not to know who the faculty member is, whether the person will be there, whether there's any continuity. So there's this structure of unstructured employment. At the same time, there is a tension between the full and the part-time faculty, because one of the reasons for cancellation of classes is bumping or displacement in favor of a full-time faculty member who needs to fill out their load. The third issue it captures is this larger sense of the public rights and benefits and interest in this negotiation process. For the students, the quality of education, their access to education, and to faculty who can engage them structurally. And that is the recognition on the part of adjunct faculty that part of the structure of their employment is lack of access to the instructional resources ahead of time and even while they're teaching that support quality education. And so I'm going to talk about on each of those areas how some contracts are addressing these issues. So I look at pay and compensation, whether it's flat, percentage, prorated. I look at the timing of when the notice is that triggers this cancellation fee, the rationales that are provided or not. And then I look at the incidence. And the two things I concentrate on are 2 versus 4-year institutions, because historically in the analyses I've done, there's often differences in those sectors. Interestingly, often favoring faculty in the 2-year sector. And combined versus part-time only units, because this is such a central issue in the adjunct faculty labor movement. Should we form a separate union? Should we align with? How are our interests being served by being part of a combined unit? So those are the kinds of analyses that I do. So here's on the incidence of the provisions. So there's overall there's 494 provisions, but there's 240 of them that are either combined units or part-time only units. 57 part-time only units and 183 combined. And then the rest of them are full-time only units. So I didn't look at those. They're obviously not going to have stuff in there negotiated about part-time faculty. The incidence is far greater in the case of the part-time units than in the combined ones. So closing in on half the agreements, 42% of those 57 agreements have some language about class cancellation. In the combined units, it's 1 out of 5. In 4-year institutions, there's this interesting reversal. In the 4-year institutions versus the 2-year institutions, the incidence is higher or lower of the part-time only or the combined units. So that's something to explore in the future. So what does the language look like, and what pay levels are we talking about? So there's a lot of variation in the compensation that's provided, but overwhelmingly it is very little compensation. Sometimes it's a percentage. So in the case of the University of Vermont, it's 5%. You take the average salary of an adjunct faculty member nationally from a survey done by the Coalition on Academic Work that John Curtis in the audience was part of, and a variety of other organizations. So it's around $3,000, $2,700 to $3,000. So that's about $150. Not a lot of money. You can see the language there of how it gets triggered. Rutgers, their lecture unit does it by, they prorate it differently, so they say 1/16. So that's like one class out of a 16-week semester, but it also calculates out to about that amount of money. In some cases, there's a flat amount. It's mostly in the low hundreds of dollars. The highest amounts were $250 at Roosevelt University in Chicago, which is a part-time only unit, and Connecticut State. I talked to VJ earlier in here. Connecticut State has a $300 cancellation fee. That's a combined unit. So two-year institutions, in this case, again, it's limited, but even more limited, unfortunately. There are a couple of contracts, and I've given you the language here, where the pay is for 1 hour. So you've been preparing this class, you're expecting to teach it, you need to be able to make rent, get food, and you get notified that, well, your class has been canceled, but we'll pay you for an hour. So there's a couple things about that. It's just insulting, number one. Number two, it constructs your work as only classroom teaching. The hour you spent in the classroom, not your preparation, So this is increasingly the structure of employment for adjunct faculty. It's in-class time. That's what's recognized. It's recognized in falsely constructing what your hour workload is so that we don't have to pay you health care benefits under the Affordable Care Act, so we construct you under the 30 hours. So this just embeds so much of the structure of employment for adjunct faculty. There are some flat amounts, again, very low. Ironically, flat amounts at Flathead Valley Community College. $100 at 4 other places. Some are a percentage. The highest percentage is 8% at Seattle Community College. What about the timing? What kind of triggering of these fees? So again, there's variation, but just like the pay, it's very, very limited. The amount of notice is always limited. Connecticut State is one of the longer ones in the 4-year institutions, 7 days before class. In other cases, the fee's triggered only if the class is canceled the day class starts. They can cancel it the day before, 3 hours before, and you get nothing. So that gives you, again, this is giving you a sense, what's the structure of employment here? In 2-year institutions, similarly, timing is a week or 2 before classes start or after classes start. And I just, again, wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the language here. And this is the Onondaga Community College contract, partly because you can read that there's a graduated, so there's a lot more detail in this clause than in the other ones. That's the first thing. But if you read down, there's a graduated pay that reaches up to 20% if the class is canceled after the 3rd or 4th class. Like, who's canceling classes after the 3rd or 4th hour? That, again, gives you a sense of the arbitrariness and randomness and unpredictability for the faculty member, for the students, of the cancellation that's taking place. Okay, rationales, very few. Very few. Typically, no rationale is mentioned, or the rationales are remarkably broad. There may be a reference to insufficient enrollment, but no mention of what exactly that enrollment is. What is that enrollment level for that class? One clause points to the stratification of faculty embedded in the contract because one of the rationales is, as I mentioned earlier, displacement of part-time by full-time faculty who need to fill out their load. In 2-year contracts, there's a little bit more provided by way of rationale, much more mention of lower insufficient enrollment, but again, totally undefined. There is one reference in a contract to inadequate funds, which really is kind of hard to credit when you consider what the salary is of the adjunct faculty member. We don't have insufficient funds in order to pay you $2,700. That's Flathead Valley, by the way. There's some, again, references to displacement by full-time faculty. So now I want to jump to some of the organizing in what's been called metro campaigns. And these campaigns have a long history in labor history. In higher education, it's a little bit more recent history. AUP ran sort of a metro effort in the Boston area some time ago. Joe Barry has written about this in his book on faculty and on organizing. And there are several unions now. The biggest one, the most campaigns are being run by the SEIU, but the steelworkers have a very strong and successful campaign, metro campaign running in Pittsburgh. Different model than SEIU, which itself has different models depending upon the city. And AFT is running a metro campaign in Philadelphia. The idea for all of them is to organize where the work is. The work is increasingly in multiple places. It's not just in one place. So you organize across a metro area, and even though you're doing campus by campus at this point, the ultimate idea is a metro contract. To be thinking about, and so do the shift with me, to be thinking about access, working conditions, learning conditions, not just of individual institutions or individual faculty members, but in metro areas. So this is a fairly creative approach to organizing. There's some other ways in which these adjunct campaigns are quite creative, very much like what Steve started us out with on the creativity of the textile workers in Lawrence in sending their kids to New York City and elsewhere to dramatize the working conditions. And a lot of creativity in terms of connecting to other low-wage workers, as we saw just earlier this week with the Fight for 15 campaign and the low-wage, raise the minimum wage for fast food workers, and at the same time be thinking about $15,000 a course for adjunct faculty. So what I did was I went to 4 places that had contracts coming out of these campaigns, and some are being negotiated now, so obviously I'm not able to do those. I know Robin's negotiating a contract at Point Park, Northeastern's negotiating, but the 4 I did were George Washington, Georgetown, American, and Tufts. And I just first went back and said, well, what about these cancellation fees? Because these guys are not in the HECUS database. These are so recent that they're not in that database. And here's what I found. First, significantly higher pay. So George Washington's cancellation fee is 20%, the highest in the other 57 contracts that or 46 that had these cancellation fees was 8%. Still, we're not talking huge money. No one's getting rich off of this, and no institution's going broke off of it. But it's a more meaningful amount of compensation than 5 or 8% or an hour or $50. Georgetown's is $300, Tufts is $750. American has a very interesting clause that if you choose one time to take a payment, you'll be paid 75% of what you would have been paid for the whole course. Much more notice is involved, although again, it's still limited. So 21 days at George Washington and Georgetown. Way more specific rationale. So each one of these contracts has mention of under what conditions will cancellation take place. George Washington's is the language I put in there. It requires that the minimum enrollment is going to be defined by the university or the school or the department in question. It's not just an arbitrary amount. It's a predetermined amount. I didn't put in here Georgetown's contract because maybe it's because of the power of the law school at Georgetown, and for whatever reason, thanks to Mon, I'm right on track. For whatever reason, it's pages and pages. And it really reads very much like a retrenchment clause in a contract that relates to faculty generally. That retrenchment will only take place when there's a reorganizing of academic programs, and so it is pages that are very much like a standard retrenchment clause in any collective bargaining agreement. Tremendous amount of detail. There's still a lot of wiggle room for management in that language, but it's some significant amount of due process being built into the working conditions of adjunct faculty. Way more due process rights in each of these contracts. Tufts got a lot of attention for the level of the salary. $7,300 for people who've been teaching for a certain amount of time, higher if you've been teaching longer, at the end of a 3-year contract. That's the level they'll be at. But what's more important in my view is the length of the contracts. So now it's 1-year contracts if you have less than 4 years of service, 2-year contracts if you have 4 to 8, 3-year if you have 8 years. That's for adjunct faculty. Instead of semester to semester, they have longer term contracts. These contracts each also have something very interesting, a more creative approach in some ways to linking the working conditions of faculty to the learning conditions of students. And Maria Masto, who's the president of NFM, and myself and Steve Street, who's now deceased, and Esther Merves, did a survey a couple years ago. And what we found was lack of access of adjunct faculty, lack of access to instructional resources. Basic stuff that is necessary to plan the class and deliver the class. Course management system access, library access, access to copying, access to syllabi, access to orientation, access to office space. So here is what we see in each of these contracts, is a clause, a provision, an article about access to instructional resources. And there's considerable detail in here in the kinds of resources that are provided. The George Washington contract connects those resources to the department in which the adjunct faculty member is working. So it's not just the institution, it's the department. There's also a nice piece of language in both A and B, like a preamble almost. The parties have a common interest in ensuring. Sometimes this can be, I know, very difficult to negotiate into your contracts, but it is a reminder that education is about education. It's not just about workforce development. We're preparing people, I think, in a democracy. And we should be caring about the quality and the scope of their education. And this is kind of a way, again, of reminding us and expanding our sense of what the negotiation is about. What are we negotiating for? So, in summary, and this will bring me back to the bread and roses and revise the end quality too. First of all, there's obviously too few provisions. A quarter of the contracts in the HECUS database have any kind of language about any sort of notice, any cancellation fee, and the like. A lot of room there because right now there's quite limited pay, limited to no notice, and almost unlimited managerial discretion, no discussion of rationales. So there's some good language that collective bargaining units can draw upon, and it's particularly incumbent on the combined units to be doing this because they have the lowest representation of decent language. I think there's a lot of opportunity to organize and negotiate around the interests of students in an affordable, quality higher education, as well as in the interests of the communities in which we're situated, to think about how in a region we're providing for. We talk a lot about engaging students. We don't talk much about engaging faculty. To that end, here's one piece of language. This is not a cancellation fee for adjunct faculty. This is in reference to full-time faculty. If a faculty member has a class canceled, they may bump an adjunct faculty member. They are the full-time faculty. But they may pick up an additional class, right? And then third, they may accept assignment and other non-teaching work as assigned by the supervising dean. I'm not sure why we can't do that for adjunct faculty. Not sure why that kind of a clause could not be applied to an adjunct faculty member whose class was canceled. And I'm going to put this on the table. We are in a situation in American higher education where we are under capacity in terms of engaging students. We, in most institutions, underserve the growth demographics and overchase the declining demographic of students who are like me. White, upper middle class, and able to go full-time. That is not the future. That is not only not tomorrow, it's not today. And so we need to be thinking about how can we more effectively engage within metro regions or rural regions, because there's a great deal of need in rural regions as well, with cooperative efforts among institutions and among bargaining units to ensure some continuity of employment in providing access and advising and outreach and support to students in order to enhance the quality of their education and the success that they have in that education. So I think these metro campaigns could be getting us to think more about regions, not just about individual institutions. And collective bargaining, in my view, is a nice vehicle for doing this, because there are already, in the public sector certainly, systems like CUNY, like SUNY, like the Cal State system, like APSCUF, like on and on and on. All publics are part of systems, basically. We should be thinking across individual campuses and even across systems. In doing this, I think what we're negotiating is not just bread, money, roses, respect among categories of faculty. We're also reanimating our public rights, our responsibilities to the communities in which we're situated, and we're reanimating and reclaiming public space by reinvesting in our mission to better educate and make the American dream actually something that's achievable for the growth demographics of our students, which I think at present we are moving quite directly away from. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Very, very interesting paper and talk. I really got to update my bio. No fault of Steve, but so for the last 3 years, I've served as professor of higher education and student affairs and chair of the Department of Counseling and Higher Education at Ohio University. And beginning July 1, I'm going to be accepting a deanship at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. So I have been approaching the topic and reading Gary's paper with some slightly different lenses. And what I want to share with you are just some thoughts that have come to mind as I've been reading through the paper. And I want to start with, the importance of reminding ourselves that recalling events in history contribute to our understanding of the present. And I'll admit, when I read the paper, I had to do a little research to understand the reference to Bread and Roses, and I did find a really nice YouTube clip, which I would recommend to folks. It's about a 6-minute clip, and it gave some very basic information about the Bread and Roses strike of the Lawrence Textile Mill. And, that takeaway for me was an important reminder of the battles that have been previously won in our country for the working conditions of an industrial society, those seeking fairness and justice in pursuing the American dream, wage increases, overtime pay, and rules against discrimination for the working class of all nationalities. The quest for efficiency and control in the factory system, equating people to machinery, reached a breaking point when the Massachusetts state legislature reduced the working week from 56 to 54 hours, and the textile plant cut wages, leading to a strike. Strikers reportedly carried banners reading "Bread and Roses." The reference to bread refers to livable wages, and the reference to roses to dignity and respect. The context for higher education and the professions is especially relevant. Wages, working conditions, and quality of life for workers in higher education and the professions are susceptible to the quest for greater efficiency and control, especially in metro areas, but also in rural, as the knowledge economy becomes central to the future of our nation. The reference reminds me also of the complexities of unionism. This well-known strike was organized by the industrial workers of the world and was led primarily by immigrant women. The American Federation of Labor and the United Textile Workers tried to end the strike, but were overridden by the rank-and-file workers and their own chosen immigrant leaders. Different people have different perspectives on the best way forward and differ in their assessment of the best strategy for attaining goals. So drawing on Gary's paper, I'd like to focus my comments on two areas. One, moving us toward developing a framework to help us understand tensions that are emerging within the academy stemming from different appointment types. And two, on some practical matters related to efficiency and quality that the analysis Gary provided related to cancellation clauses brings to mind. First, the data on the distribution of employees by appointment type are well known. Gary referenced these statistics in his paper, but evidence that informs our understanding of the confluence of the pressures that are being put on faculty work resulting from this new reality is much harder to come by. Higher education must embrace the complexity of academic work in this new environment and provide flexible options for faculty and for students in order to succeed. This creates a lot of tension. And one way to look at this may be to identify the push and pull factors that contribute to solidarity versus stratification among faculty within a given environment. From a structural perspective, what are the policies and procedures that are in place at our institutions that either promote or detract from solidarity or stratification? How do we refer to different groups of faculty, for example? At my institution, Ohio University, we've traditionally used language that referred to our faculty by groups: Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, and Group 4. Group 1 being the tenure track, Group 2 being people who were essentially full-time non-tenure track, but who technically were not eligible to work full-time. So you had to be like 0.98 FTE. The Group 3 faculty were our part-time faculty, and Group 4 were visiting. We're moving away from that language. Language really matters. So we're moving away from that language where we are referring to our tenure track faculty, and we're using new language to refer to the Group 2 as career teaching track faculty. And there is a recognition of the role that these non-tenure track faculty play in terms of their instructional responsibilities. So their workload is distributed between teaching and service and no expectation for research. Now, I personally believe that there are issues, that we have to deal with in terms of, those designations between individuals who are not eligible for a tenure track position and who are not given as part of their responsibilities conducting research because of that inextricable link between teaching and research, which we know is so important. But nonetheless, I think it is a step in the right direction that we are getting away from language to refer to people as Group 2. So I think that's a good thing. There's been a push for institutions also, and we are doing this at Ohio University as well, to recognize the contributions of off-track faculty by providing possibility for promotion. So in addition to getting away from Group 2 and referring to these individuals as career teaching track faculty, they have possibility of promotion where they're brought in with the title lecturer. They can be promoted to associate lecturer and to senior lecturer. And there's, I think, some growing momentum for institutions to put policies in place such as this across the country. To what extent has this created more cohesion among the faculty? And to what extent has it contributed to or furthered a class system among the professoriate? And does this look different maybe in a combined and a PTO environment? Another structural indicator, who votes in elections? Gappa and Leslie referred to the invisible faculty. It's pretty hard to be invisible when you're the new majority, but still there are culture and climate issues that contribute to a more or less positive working environment for all who are in higher education. What's that tipping point in an academic department when it becomes noticeable that a particular group of individuals are excluded from shared governance processes? The faculty handbook specifies who's eligible to vote, what constitutes a majority for a policy to pass, and a majority of whom? If it's a policy that focuses on promotion for full-time non-tenure track faculty, for example, is it necessary to have a majority of tenured and tenure track faculty support it? What policies and procedures are in place at your institutions that either promote or detract from cohesion among faculty with different employment appointment types? In our question and answer, which I hope we'll have time for, we'll be able to share some of those. Gary referenced language in some contracts that have built-in bumping rights of full-time faculty. Does this practice promote a positive culture and climate at institutions? To date, our climate surveys have inadequately assessed the culture and climate for employees of different appointment types. That's a place where I think we can do better. Furthermore, we need to do more to establish the relationship between a positive work environment and a positive learning environment. As Gary says, quote, for faculty's working conditions are quite directly students' learning conditions, end quote. This line of inquiry will resonate with policymakers and higher education leaders. So we should always ask ourselves, does this policy or practice enhance or detract from the learning environment for our students? Finally, I'd like to make just a few comments about the relationship between efficiency and quality and about the analysis of the cancellation clauses language. I think it's important not to see efficiency and quality as an either-or, but rather a both-and. But I think in higher education, we need another word to describe efficiency so as not to fall into the trap of equating people with machines a la Lawrence Textile Mill. So I'm reminded of the NEA campaign, Degrees Not Debt, and I wonder if focusing on affordability gets us closer to where we need to be in higher education. We are called, especially in public higher education, to be good stewards of resources. We must not sacrifice quality, but it has to be a balance. As department chair, I've had to make decisions about prorating summer pay for classes that did not meet minimum enrollment. Of course, it's easier to do that when the courses are overloads for tenured faculty who have signed up to teach more classes in the summer than they taught during the regular academic year. That's a topic for another day. We do need to ask ourselves how these decisions impact our students. As Gary said, our students are not the same today as they have been, and technically, we should notify students if a class is going to be canceled in time for them to make other arrangements too. How do these clauses Gary identified affect our students? A conversation we've started having is when is it appropriate to add an additional section when enrollment goes over a certain cap? If it's a course that an adjunct professor is teaching, should they have the option to teach the second section? I'm curious if there's any language about that in the contracts. So again, I want to leave lots of time for discussion, so I've tried to pose a lot of questions for us to consider, and I have been purposefully brief in what I've decided to share with you. But I want to leave you just with this. I think we need to figure out a way to make sure that we don't forget that in higher education, we really do need an H in efficiency. We need humanity in our efficiency and our focus on our efforts in doing this in a way that has the best interest of our students in mind. Thank you.
Sound check. Can you hear me? My name is Sue Sherman. I'm Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers, which curiously enough, is the State University of New Jersey. Very proud of it. And I'm also a professor of labor studies in the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations. Fortunately for you, I'm recovering from bronchitis and laryngitis, so I will merely quote you the opening lines from Bread and Roses rather than sing them. As we come marching in the breaking of the day, 1,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 milltops gray. It's basically the rising of the women is the rising of the race. And it's the proud anthem of the labor movement since that time. And I was really delighted that Gary drew on that for his paper. And I was really, really struck with your excellent comments, Valerie. I'm going to bring two seemingly contradictory perspectives to what I'm about to say. First is having spent 4 years as dean of a school of management and labor relations, in which we have tried very hard to balance the relationship between our tenure-track faculty, our fixed-term or non-tenure-track faculty, and our part-time lecturers, AKA adjuncts, in the context of like most other states, a declining state appropriation that means the trajectory for the future is that our university, like most, will be increasingly dependent on tuition revenues. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say the primary source of surplus value in the university is the additional revenues generated by the non-tenured and the fixed-term faculty. In fact, without that, there is no way for us to compensate in our school, one of the top research faculties in their field in the world. There is no way for us to compete with the other people, other institutions trying to hire them, unless we can find a source of revenue. So that's the management hat. In my other life, I have led, along with a colleague, Adrian Eaton, who will be here this afternoon, we're just completing a 5-year study of changes in work and employment globally and trade union responses to those changes. And I think the short version of the story is that what Gary's describing for contingent faculty is just one little piece of a larger pattern that is happening all over the world. It's happening from the social welfare democracies of the Scandinavian countries in Germany. It's happening in all of the Anglo countries, and it's happening in the new economies that have joined us in the last 20 years. I will say that, so what I want to do is step up a little bit from the present case and put this in the larger pattern that we see going on globally, and also to say a little bit about what trade unions are not or are doing, and a little advice, I think, for those of you who are in the trade union business about strategy. If my remarks sound slightly neo-Marxist, I would remind you of a wonderful piece by John Cassidy in the New Yorker several years ago that I teach my students, which is, Marx may have got communism wrong, but he got capitalism just about right. And the fact of the matter is, capitalism has come to the public higher education world. It has invaded with a speed and relentlessness that I think to those of us of my generation has been breathless. Why should higher ed be different from any other sector of the economy in the world? It is simply part of a larger pattern of what some call market fundamentalism. In Europe, they call it neoliberalism. It simply means a belief that the market is better than other solutions to all problems. As we've looked at what's happening globally, the short version of it is that what we have heretofore understood as something called standard employment or formal employment, that would be a job with a relatively predictable salary, hours, benefits attached to it, and a labor code that regulates what can and can't be done. That thing, standard employment, is disappearing all over the world in various ways, at various speeds, but it's happening everywhere. And it's happening because of the creation of contingent, various forms of, quote, flexibility or contingency. And one of the there are many forms, I won't bore you with the 4 forms of flexibility. You can read my paper for that. But one of the primary purposes of flexibility all over the world is to change employment from standard employment to some kind of contingent employment, thereby escaping most, if not all, of the labor codes of that country. So, as we've seen this happen, we've been looking at the people who are called waste pickers in Brazil. We've been looking at minibus drivers in Georgia, the country. We've been looking at contingent hospitality workers in South Africa, at women who are hired by the big Danish beer company Carlsberg in Cambodia under called a Cambrew, to directly sell beer to customers in the beer garden. We've looked at port workers who unload the ships in Portuaria, Colombia, and others. I won't go into all of them. And what we've seen is a pattern worldwide of this growth of contingent work, primarily to escape labor codes. We've also seen that in all cases, everywhere, workers are in fact organizing. And indeed, they're organizing, in many cases, in the face of opposition from the existing trade union organizations. I'll come to that in a second. This has driven me and my colleagues back to the foundation literature of labor studies and industrial relations. I reread Beatrice and Sidney Webb, and I was reminded that they talk about two trade union devices. They call one the law of numbers and the other the common rule. The law of numbers basically says you organize members and you represent them in a sector of some kind. The common rule says you organize everybody and you work for the greater good of all. I also reread one of the most important pieces in the American industrial relation literature by one of the founding institutional economists, John R. Commons, a wonderful case on the history of the shoemaking trade in the United States. I won't give you the whole thing, but basically what Commons outlines from the founding, from before the Revolution to the growth of the factory, the way in which changes in the market for shoes put pressure on the existing producers in terms of price and quality. And he traces this all the way through to the factory system, in effect, pretty much eliminated handmade shoes, except for what they used to call the bespoke. Actually, they still call it that in the UK, I noticed, or the custom-made shoe. And Commons identifies the nature of the competition, and he uses a wonderful term that we're adopting, the competitive menace. So I'm thinking about Commons, and I'm thinking about the Webbs, and I'm thinking about a wonderful piece by Steve Lopez from the late 80s, which he looked at a campaign, public sector campaign, I think in Pittsburgh, if I'm not mistaken, in which he noticed that workers in this union had a very easy time joining a campaign that was really focused on behalf of their clients in the welfare system, and they had a terrible time turning out when the campaign was strictly about their own wages and benefits. And Stephen Lopez calls this, and others have talked about this as well, the central dilemma of trade unions, the dilemma of their legacy on the one hand and their ideology on the other hand. And so I think what this puts squarely front and center is that the compromise that was achieved in the 20th century between labor and capital, Gramsci called it a compromise, the Marxists now call it a negative compromise, meaning that they came to an agreement that if they continued to oppose each other more, it would be to the detriment of both parties. That compromise is over. And in fact, capital has gained the upper hand and worker power has been weakened. And this is not true just in the United States. It's even true in Sweden. They lament that they now have only 69% of the workforce organized. But that is down from something like 90, and so they're right to be concerned. What we find globally in examining how do trade unions respond to the growth of contingent work is that their first response is exclusion. Because the 20th century structure of collective bargaining between an employer and a union, the 20th century structure of labor relations is premised on collective bargaining. When there's no employer of record or employment relationship, there's no collective bargain as we have known it. And unions have evolved to think in terms of we represent the people who are employed in a particular employment relationship. We do that through bargaining. Therefore, we don't really recognize, once you're out, you're unemployed, or you've been outsourced to a third-party provider and you're no longer an employee, at least not of ours, we no longer have a sense of obligation to represent you. In addition, and I think this case is a perfect illustration, the growth of this contingent workforce may very well benefit the remaining members of the workforce to whom the union feels obligated to represent. And hence you get a conflict that develops between the existing collective bargaining membership and these new groups. What's important, I think, I'm getting a little sign here on 2 minutes, I may ignore it. What we've learned from our global study is that in almost every case where there is a successful campaign, it starts with recognizing the moral core, the right of workers to a living wage, their recognition as workers, and also, in many cases, the moral outrage of a constituency that may be being harmed as well. And I think what Gary has identified here about the importance of the linking contingent faculty to a metro campaign and linking the idea of fair compensation for faculty to other low-wage workers is one side of that. And the other side of it is, as you correctly point out, the linking it to the quality of instruction that we in our higher ed system think we're the best at and want to remain the best at. In addition, the Metro campaign, I think, is responsive to this idea that there is a structure to labor markets. And when the Webbs talked about the rule of numbers, they weren't just talking about what an old friend of mine who was a union organizer used to call the mirror test. We're going to put a mirror up to their lips, and if they're breathing, we'll organize them. That, in fact, the goal of a union, particularly in our system in the United States, is to organize people who are in the same labor market in competition. Take labor costs out of competition. There are a number of ways to cut that. You can do that by sector, but you can also do it by geography. And what the Metro campaigns recognize is that many of these contingent faculty work for many institutions in the same basic areas. So if you organize them all, you don't disadvantage any particular employer in the same way that you don't want to just organize McDonald's where they're leaving Burger King scot-free. You have to organize the labor market. So I think I'll close because we do want to have plenty of time for you to ask questions or argue back with us. I have been a critic for many, many years of what I have called the structure of competition inside the U.S. labor movement. A Canadian friend of mine used to always refer to organizing by American unions as a blood sport between them. And I always agreed with that until in fact, The SEIU's approach to the fight for 15, but particularly to organizing contingent faculty, has persuaded me that competition is sometimes crucial. Because some of the other unions, no offense to any of you in the room, I'll soon be a member of one of you again, some of the existing unions have in fact been very slow to try new forms of organizing and to understand that, and Gary's data I think bears it out, the idea that these folks should be in separate bargaining units, as opposed to recognizing that all faculty are in this together. And if they're not in it together, solving the problem together, all of them will fail, is demonstrated by the competition that the SEIU has put pressure on. We're going to see a lot more contingent faculty, or in fact, organizing in general. I want to close by saying one further neo-Marxist thing. A very smart guy named Eric Wright wrote a paper in 2000, the name of which escapes me at the moment, but it has to do with the idea of what he calls positive class compromise. And basically what the argument says is that, negative compromise between capital and labor, or between the employer and the worker and the union, it's a good thing. It's better than the alternative. But a better alternative is when labor is strong enough to actually help the employer solve certain problems. In particular, two types. In public higher education, organized labor has as much clout in legislatures as does the university administration. And it's going to take all of that to restore education as a public as opposed to a private good. There's an area where what Eric calls the political arena, in which there is ample opportunity for positive compromise. The second area is in what the economists call collective action problems. Those are the problems that occur inside the classroom, inside the labor process. Those are the places where, as Gary's talking about, when you don't provide contingent faculty with the tools that they need and the time that they need to do the kind of quality job that we think we're part of, you're damaging the entire enterprise. I'm delighted that in our contract at Rutgers, for our part-time lecturers, it encourages the faculties to embrace these folks and bring them into the faculty governance process for the betterment of the learning environment. I think it's terrific. And in order for any of this to happen, however, labor has to recover what in our field we call associational power. Unions, first of all, have to recruit and organize new members, but then unions have to get past their tendency to compete with each other and rebuild what we call, John Commons called the horizontal labor movement, unions working together, amassing their collective power so that workers in the education sector understand that the building trades are not wrong when they're upset about the tax base that they're paying. And they're just wrong to pin it on their fellow public sector workers, and vice versa. So with that, I will close with a strong argument for rebuilding associational power.
Now that I no longer feel like a drowning rat, as I did feel when I arrived, first I want to congratulate Gary on a really interesting paper, and I think part of its power is that there are many injustices that adjunct professors face: pay, lack of benefits, lack of offices. But you really highlight with your microscope one area where what happens when your class is canceled. I was for the first time in my life, I was an adjunct professor last fall at Wesleyan University. I taught a writing course, and I must have spent 40 or 50 hours in the summer preparing. I would have killed someone if they canceled the class and didn't pay me. That's off the record. Bread and roses. I'm going to mouth off for a minute or two, forgive me. Bread and roses. My sense is it's not just bread, wages, and roses meaning dignity, but it's roses meaning give us an ability to not just be work slaves working 54, 56 hours a week, but to enjoy some of life. I made a big mistake when I wrote my book, The Big Squeeze, a few years ago. I interviewed at length an adjunct professor in California who taught at 3 universities, literally from 8 in the morning till, running around, driving around, commuting until like 9 at night. And I made the huge mistake of leaving him out of the book because I decided at some point I'm only going to write about private sector workers because private sector workers were taking it on the chin. He taught at 3 state community colleges, and I thought I can't have a government worker here. This is before government workers started taking it on the chin a year or two later. I've often wondered why all of a sudden, sometimes when I give speeches, I say the one area in all of American labor where organizing is taken off, like prairie fire, is adjuncts. And it's really true. It's really amazing what's going on. And I often wonder, why has this happened right now? Is it just that the SEIU organizes better than some of the other unions? Or maybe it's just that the SIU has better public relations and makes me think it's spreading like prairie fire. But to follow up on what Sue Sherman said, I think it's been so successful partly because adjuncts feel extremely aggrieved. Second, the SIU really knows how to organize. And I think the citywide campaign is very smart because once you win at Georgetown or GW, well, the people at American University say, hey, I want that too. And my sense is it's not so much it's to create uniform standards to the back door, not because American is saying, well, we can't get professors because Georgetown's paying more, but if Georgetown gives great benefits or great cancellation policies, then the American University or George Washington, they're going to say, hey, this isn't fair, we want the same thing. So I think that those are among the reasons it's really caught on. And the last thought, I also thought that competition between unions was bad and could be a blood sport. But having written about labor for 20 years for the New York Times, I saw there are whole fields of the workforce that some unions were just totally ignoring.
Exactly.
And I think of great swaths of the retail sector where there was just very little effort, or restaurant organizing. So where you see the SAUs coming in on Fight for 15, and I think a lot of people feel the way you do, Sue, that, competition may not be so bad. Anyway, now that I've mouthed off plenty, last comment. So my father, Morty Greenhouse, was a high school teacher on Long Island, Lindenhurst, and he made a good salary as a public school teacher. And I remember I was a beginning reporter, and I used to say, how come public school teachers earn so much more than reporters, plus you get 12 weeks off during the summer? But at the same time, he was an adjunct professor at National Community College, and I was always amazed that the full-time professors were like making $120,000 a year, and my father, an adjunct, was making maybe $2,500 a course, maybe four courses, $10,000 a year compared to what a full-time professor makes. And I thought there's something wrong there. Anyway, on that note, we will open the floor to questions. If there's someone who has a microphone. Okay. So try to track this. I can't even see. Okay, there's a microphone over here if you have questions.
Yes, I do have a question. I'm an adjunct faculty member or day laborer, whatever you want to call me. And I have the unique privilege of being part of an 8-member team as the one adjunct that will be negotiating a new contract in October. And I'm very fond of Gary's comments because I have already prepared some of those particular arguments and done some research on that. But one question that I have that comes up with our constituency is the fact that the university may issue you a contract for the fall. In the contract, it would say that this contract is contingent on the class being filled to the appropriate level. So these faculty members basically are without income during the summer. They go for unemployment. The Unemployment Compensation Bureau says, well, that's between you and the university as to whether they will approve that. The university says, no, that's between the state and federal government unemployment laws. So these faculty members, who would probably be paid a pittance through the unemployment compensation program based on their salary, are left stranded and have no guarantee of employment. And when you inform them we have no guarantee of employment, they say basically that's up to the university. So if somebody wants to kind of comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
This is actually something the new faculty majority has been doing a lot of work on to make more available to contingent faculty across the nation in different states. What are your rights by way of getting unemployment? How are contracts and agreements between a department head and an adjunct faculty member compromising of their ability to get unemployment? I think it's also an example of how, and first, thank you so much for the comments, all of you. The comments were fabulous. The issue of the competition among unions, there's also kind of an inside-outside strategy that Joe Barry and many others talk about. You work within some organizations, but you work in others to leverage those organizations that you're a member of. This is an example of that, I think, with new faculty majority. If you're not working in multiple levels in multiple organizations as contingent faculty to push, then you get the sort of compromise that Sue described so nicely historically, which does not address the needs of the majority of the faculty. The survey that Maria Masto and Steve Street and Esther and I did of adjunct faculty included faculty in bargaining units. So these conditions are not just conditions of people in settings where there's no collective bargaining. It's also where they're in combined units where they're not protected, and sometimes in part-time only units. So I think one of the answers is work on multiple levels to address the kinds of concerns that you're articulating. I actually did, because of time, I didn't put it up there, but there's one provision that speaks to the provision of tentative contracts, which is basically what you're describing, right? It's a contingent you have a contract contingent on. They had to provide those tentative contracts within a week before classes start, but then they could cancel the day class starts. So that too just heightens the sense of the absurdity of this relationship. And I think the challenge is for us to more and more, and the adjunct labor movement is doing this quite well, I think, clarify how that insanity translates into an insanity on the part of students. Like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what's being offered. It's not a surprise that there are going to be composition classes at, institutions around the country. We ought to be able to predict this with a little more regularity than we do now, or algebra classes, or whatever it is. And if we can't do it for an individual institution, we ought to be able to do it across a region, whether it's a metro region or otherwise.
Hello. I'm Susan DiRamo from City College. I've taught as an adjunct for many years. So my question is, how do you convince a negotiating team to bargain for more money for adjuncts than for full-timers? Because as the reporter said, your dad worked as an adjunct, and I'm making $3,500 a course at City College after 34 years, but I'm still teaching, and I love it, and I love the City University. But we're getting close to finish our contract, hopefully. And full-timers want a raise, too. So how do you do that? I mean, one of the ways that we're trying to do it, adjunct organizers are saying, well, give every adjunct an office hour. So that would raise our pay by a significant amount. But that would take a lot out of the whole package. So is there any, I know it's not an easy question, is there any way And just to finish up, I went to a conference on higher ed, and they said that in some campuses, they might give full-time faculty a 1.5 raise and maybe adjuncts a 3% raise. But it is hard to convince full-time faculty or people in the negotiating team to give more to adjuncts. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to answer? You want to answer?
You're trying to get me to commit some sort of professional suicide here, aren't you? Well, I would go back to what I said earlier. I think that the central challenge of those who remain in standard employment and the unions who represent them is to understand that if they don't recruit the contingent workforce into their organizations and view them as colleagues and part of the whole, how shall I put this? They shall surely find themselves in the same situation as those who make custom shoes.
Yeah, I think there's some good examples nationally, and I just came, as I mentioned, from Chicago, and when I was at the AUP, that campaign was kicked off at the University of Illinois Chicago, and one of the leaders there is a guy named Walter Ben Michael, an English professor. And someone was asking him this question, because that campaign struggled with the faculty wanted to be a joint non-tenure track, tenure track unit. The administration kept fighting that, saying, no, you have separate communities of interest. Eventually, the faculty union relented, but they continued to basically bargain together, even though they're separate units. And when a reporter was asking Walter Ben Michael, so how did, it may have been Colleen Flaherty, or I've forgotten exactly who it was, anyway, asked, so how did you come to this realization that you needed to work together? So Walter's a tenure track faculty. He says, well, you know, we thought about circling the wagons, and then we realized there's nobody inside the circle. If you go a little further back in history, you can say, and I've used this phrase before, at some point, as Thomas Paine said in Common Sense, it is absurd for a continent to be ruled by an island. And that is where we are as a workforce. And so I think the competition that we're seeing is a variety of groups. SEIU is one, the steel workers is another. United Auto Workers are organizing postdocs and graduate employees, partly because the established unions didn't move to those workforces. At some point, I think there has to be kind of a combination of the positive compromise that you were talking about, Sue, that both management and labor recognize the disinvestment in public higher education by the state and by city governments. I'm in a state where the state government just zeroed out community colleges. No more support at all for community colleges. None. Now, it was down to 2%, but still, that's like a message. You are no longer a responsibility of the state. So I think there needs to be that kind of positive compromise, and at the same time, there has to be some internal recognition of our future is together. And we're already in a position where you can't circle the wagons. There's nobody inside the circle.
Yes, I am Lynette Nyaga. I'm the president of the Community College Association in California, and I'm from one of the established unions, NEA. And I would like to answer the question from the person before me. What it has to do with is the culture that you create in your institution. And it's important to recognize that the full-time faculty need to lead in this area. And when we've had that happen in our colleges, which are separate colleges under one system, but they bargain separately, I can tell you we have had increases for part-time faculty when full-time faculty got no increases. I can cite 3 examples: Mount San Antonio College, Southwestern College, and the third one flew out of my head. But we have three that we have three specifically, and I know more, but I wanted you to know that it is possible to do that, and that it is up to us to create a culture where we share the same values and care about each other. That's what unions are about. I also wanted to say that in California, our part-time faculty are normally join the CalSTRS retirement system. And I wanted to caution people against stipends for office hours rather than salary increases, because those separate payments, any separate payments do not count towards retirement, whereas if you were to roll the payments into the salary, which they've done at Gavilan College, then the part-time faculty get more retirement credit from the college.
Thank you.
Those are really important points. Let me just mention another positive compromise. I've just finished a working paper that I'm going to release shortly on the relationship between faculty labor costs and tuition increases. Because so often the assumption is, well, if it's this fixed pie and if faculty get increases, there goes tuition, and we don't want to. So there's this tension. It's like we're pitted against the students. So in the last 10 years, using national data in every sector of higher education, every non-profit sector of higher education, the share of institutional expenditures that goes to instruction has declined. The level of that share is way lower than most people realize. It's less than a third. And so I think there's room for a positive compromise among part-time and full-time faculty to say we need to increase investment in instruction. In an institution that has got its core mission about instruction, then we're like a charity that asks people to pay tuition to donate to us, but then we spend 60 to 70% of that money on non-core mission functions. And so there are a range of reports over the past 10 years that have come out to this effect. I think the AUP's new release of its survey speaks to what proportion of institutional expenditures do faculty salaries account for. I think too often we think if we ask for too much, then the students are going to suffer. The story is salaries have been flat and tuition has been escalating. So the costs are somewhere else. And part of our positive compromise could be maybe we need to spend a little bit less on some of these other things and a little bit more on investing in the people who are teaching the students, both full-time and part-time faculty.
Gary's saying too much is being spent on athletic facilities, but okay.
Not just athletic facilities. I traveled to a campus when I was general secretary that had a graduation rate of 34%, largely commuter first-generation students, an access university in the state of Ohio, which had just spent $17 million on a student rec center that had a lazy river, because they're trying to chase out-of-state, upper-middle-class students to pay higher and higher tuition. So it's not only athletics, it's also all these amenities that we chase.
Okay, so it's approaching 12 o'clock. Let's take these two questions, comments, and then at once, and then the panel will respond.
So my name's Larry Alcoff. I'm with the Service Employees International Union and actually lead the negotiations in the Boston private sector for the union. I want to commend the panel first. I actually thought it was an extraordinarily interesting panel because it captured sort of the two larger sort of meta-narratives of how does the a question of contingent and adjunct faculty fit into the larger context of social justice and into the context of a neoliberal economy and the sort of low-wage economy. I thought that was a really important sort of context. And the other meta-narrative really is, where does education, teaching, and the valuing of education and teaching fit into the institution's core mission, and how is it reflected both in the language and practices of the institution? And then the intersection in collective bargaining, where we try and actually operationalize it, sometimes with more success than other times. So I thought it was just an excellent panel because it actually did capture that larger meta-narratives and within the context of the bargaining for contingent faculty. So thank you very much for that. I also wanted to speak briefly to the question raised by the faculty member who's a member of the PSC, a very fine union here in New York, and the issue of the adjunct faculty in the PSC. And in other unions, I think there's sort of a fundamental question in the question. And it's not about the hours versus whatever. It's, if somebody teaches 34 years at City College, why are they still considered contingent? Why at some point can't we get to a point where a part-time faculty position can be a regularized position in the economy and in the institution, paid in a pro rata manner, benefited in a pro rata manner, and included in the life of the faculty and the institution in the way that it should be? So I think the underlying question is that the paradigm, the current paradigm that allows a 34-year faculty member to be treated as a piecework employee who is disposable and contingent, is a paradigm that needs to be challenged at its core, and it should be challenged by the CUNY leadership and other educational institutions. It shouldn't have to just come from the adjuncts. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm Ted Nebus. I'm with SEIU 32BJ, also in Boston, but work in totally different projects.
SEIU Stereo. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Also a proud Rutgers alumni of Sue's program. So what I was wondering is if in the combined units, if you find them growing more towards including the adjunct professors in the bargaining committees, and how that has, and if that has an effect on the cancellation fees in particular. Thanks.
That's a really good question, and that database makes that possible because it includes contracts over, it's not just current contracts, it's contracts dating back sometimes a decade or more. I have not done that analysis. I would guess, though, given the levels, that there has not been that much change over time. There certainly has been, there's some exemplars of combined units where the sort of representation that you're talking about exists. Probably the best known one, the largest one, I know I'm in New York City, but is the California Faculty Association, where members of the bargaining team, representation regionally and elsewhere is deeply embedded for contingent faculty. And the PSC has also negotiated and has representation of contingent faculty, some really important conditions, as has the UUP. I think whether that has translated yet into these kinds of clauses is an open question. I think what's become clear is that they can be negotiated. And it's not just only in these relatively wealthy institutions. In Local 500, Montgomery County Community College, so it's a community college and it's public, has a similar clause. I don't know exactly, I have to ask when that was negotiated and whether that was the benchmark for GW and Georgetown or whether it was vice versa. That when GW and Georgetown got it, another member of that local said, hey, we should be able to do this too. But I think it's an important question, I'm not sure.
Thanks to a very excellent panel, really appreciate it.